I'm Maggie Parkhurst from Global Upside. Welcome to today's virtual open house. Our panelists will begin by addressing the top HR and payroll considerations in the Asia-Pacific region and conclude with a question and answer session. Please enter your questions via the chat window located at the bottom of your screen at any time. We will answer these questions in the order they are received. If we are not able to address all questions during our live session, we will respond to you individually via email. First up, I'd like to introduce our CEO, Raghu Bhargava. Raghu is an award-winning entrepreneur who has spent his career helping companies tackle accounting, payroll, HR, and compliance challenges in over 100 countries. Prior to Global Upside, he held leadership positions at several companies, including Deloitte and NetIQ. Our next contributor is Andrew Wilson. Andrew helped some of the world's leading companies tackle complex global HR and payroll challenges. Prior to Global Upside, Andrew worked at PricewaterhouseCoopers, Oracle, and also consulted for companies like Nestle, P&G, and Pepsi-Cola. Also on our panel is Nathan North, Director of Global Payroll. Nathan helps our clients develop robust payroll processes, systems, policies, and programs. Prior to Global Upside, Nathan managed global payroll for leading employers, including Netflix. Now over to you, Raghu.
Thank you, Meg. And even though we had planned on a Q&A type format for the webinar, what we found is, as the questions came in, is that there's a lot of questions around certain topics. So what we did was we modified the format a tiny bit to go through some of these basics about employment and key considerations so that we can address those for the whole group, and then we'll get into specific country issues as well as specific questions to answer those. So what are some of the key considerations in hiring in Asia Pacific region? So employment options, just like in the US, you have a few ways to hire people, most simply as a contractor, more complicated a little bit as you get into the PEO model or employer of record model. And you can obviously incorporate a subsidiary in any part of the world and hire people under that. Now, obviously, some of this depends on your plans. If you just want to hire somebody for a very short period, contractor is a great answer. But if you want to have one person on an extended period, setting up a subsidiary can be a little bit more expensive. So hiring as a PEO or an employer of record is a great answer. Then obviously, if you're going to open manufacturing facilities or expand big time into a particular country, then setting up your own subsidiary makes a lot of sense. Number two item to consider here is the employment contracts. Most of us in the US are familiar that employment is at will in the US. That concept stops at the border. There is no employment at will outside the US. It is all by contract. So you are not signing, you're not providing an offer letter. Somebody isn't just accepting your offer. It is a contract that both parties have to sign and agree to. These employment contracts have to be bilingual in many countries. They have to comply with the local law. They have to address all kinds of issues, from vacation to holidays to severance computations in many countries, things like that. The work time regulations, what are the working times, how does overtime get handled, things like that. They also provide termination protection both to the employer as well as the employee. So you may, in some countries, agree up front as to what the termination would be depending on length of service and what the notice periods might be. What period of time they cannot go work for a competitor, as an example, things like that. And what happens if either party breaches the contract. And because it is a contract, you have to have all of those T's and C's very well defined. Generally, these are written by lawyers, not by HR people. In US, as an example, there are very, very few benefits that are required by law or by statute. So when the Affordable Care Act came into play, we were now, as an employer, required to provide health benefits. Before that, there wasn't any requirements, like a 401k is an optional supplementary offering as a benefit. In most countries, there are three types of benefits that you're subject to. Statutory benefits. These are benefits that are defined by law. and every employer has to cater to that, and every employee is subject to those benefits. Then there are supplementary benefits. So if you are a company that really wants to take care of your employees very well, you may offer some supplementary benefits in addition to what the statutory requirements is. Maybe a better healthcare plan, maybe life insurance, things like that that may not be required under the statute in that country. And then there is the customary requirement. So if you are in the high-tech business, the benefits are generally a little bit richer versus in other industries where the benefits might be a little bit skinnier. And those you kind of have to understand the local market, your company, your industry, and your management's philosophy to put in place. The next item is payroll. So obviously, we all need to get paid, whether it's whatever the frequency might be. Outside of the US, the frequency typically is once a month. Rarely do you get paid more frequently than that, especially if you're a blue-collar worker. If you're a white-collar worker. Blue-collar workers in many countries are paid more frequently. With payroll comes the issue of computation. Obviously, somebody has to take the gross pay, divide by the 12, 13, 14 periods that apply to that country, and then compute the net pay or the social taxes or other taxes that are deducted. As you compute these taxes and pay the payroll, then there is that requirement to pay these taxes to the government or various taxing authorities. There might be benefit reporting or like pension contributions that are deducted from your paycheck that need to be provided to be funded to the benefits provider. And then obviously there's payroll reporting, whether it's around new hires, terminations, and various other matters that are rolled up into payroll reporting by country. And then lastly, the all-encompassing hire to retire, from sort of how do you hire the people, the staffing questions, how do you find the right talent in that country, things like that, the onboarding cycles, the ongoing workforce management in terms of employee life cycle maintenance, things like that, the changes to employees' marital status or birth of a child, how do you incorporate that in the benefit plan, and managing the benefit plans themselves, because even though some of these plans are statutory in requirement, they are provided by private companies, and you have to administer them just like you would administer any supplemental benefit. And then there is the issue of the workforce visibility. So what tools do you have to manage your workforce across multitude of countries? Even if you're in two countries, how do you run reports? How do you manage to see what your workforce looks like across those two countries? With that, I'm going to turn over to Andrew to talk about some country-specific issues.
So yeah, we try to summarize what was regarded as the three most complex countries to enter in Asia, and some of the issues from an ongoing perspective, as well as a perspective of things that are happening right now that are making changes in terms of employment practices and effects on payroll. Obviously in China, typically companies are going in using the wholly foreign-owned enterprises, and typically will open up in free trade zones such as Shanghai, Beijing. In all circumstances, there is requirements in China to organize the pre-employment medical exam. You need to have touch with a local medical clinic to carry out the exam, and there are filing requirements, record requirements as it's specific. Often, if you want to establish a network, then you do need to accommodate the fact that employment is specific to the city and the canton of residence, and often companies do open up branch networks to support having geographically different people located in those areas. And it is a consideration in terms of having a workforce that is geographically dispersed. Some of the hot topics in China are, China is regarded as having very generous termination severance payments. The government is trying to address cutting back on these payments, but they are mandated by law. And it is something to consider, especially when you're entering into employment agreements. The other area is that work authorization for foreign nationals. There is now a national registry. All foreign nationals do have to register, and companies have to adhere to this if they are employing them. And there are implications from a payroll perspective as well.
One item to consider in China from a payroll perspective is from a payroll timeline, giving yourself time for a more manual process than what we might be used to here in the U.S. Also, in relation to expats and foreign nationals, not only do they need to be registered, but you also need to make sure that you're following, if they're a U.S. employee, that they're taxed on the worldwide income.
Next is India, where we talk about there's a lot of requirements as it relates to termination of employment, and there is a specific requirement as it relates to relieving letters, and specifically stating at a bare minimum length of employment with the company, position attained, and often employees will ask you for more information. There are also tax documentation you have to get into in terms of a severance. There is a lot of government mandated benefit plans over there: gratuity fund, employee welfare fund, provident fund. Some of these only are mandated once you get to 50 employees or more. However, they are very special to the employees because they do often mean very enhanced benefits in terms of their pension and savings plans and ongoing consideration compensation. You will find employees in India do have a lot of interaction with you. They are constantly working on their CTC and their tax collections and their Mediclaims. As they are employed by you and they don't get a lot of the benefits of the gray economy over there, they do make a lot of things happen. And at the moment, there is a lot of changes going on as it relates to unions in the IT industry, and specifically around the fact of their employment terms.
Yeah, and also keep in mind in India with record keeping is incredibly important. There are some electronic capabilities now, but also there are some manual reports you must keep on file at all times to be reviewed by the government. So keep that in mind. And also in regards to the unions, make sure that you have a proper copy of the agreement, especially in the IT industry, to make sure all your programs are in compliance.
And the last one we wanted to talk about specifically was Japan. There is a lot of issues around employment in Japan, especially with the declining population and the intention of the government to try and change a lot of employment practices to encourage people to stay in the workforce. A lot of discussion about regular and non-regular employment, which is around temporary workers as opposed to permanent or full-time workers. There also is considerations in terms of fixed-term contracts as opposed to non-fixed-term contracts. Fixed-term contracts can be up to 5 years or more, but a lot of in terms of what the terms of employment changes in that. The other thing that is happening in Japan is that there is a lot of work-life considerations, and they are really looking towards limiting the amount of time people do work. They consider they do overwork, and so they are trying to limit the amount of overtime worked, and they are trying to bring in concepts of actually taking time off in specific work days and really address the issue of them working too much. To encourage more people staying in the workforce and more people to enter the workforce, they are promoting equal pay and advancement for women and the elderly so that they can maintain a critical mass in the workforce. And there are some specifics around sort of around payroll requirements that Nathan will address.
Yeah, so in regards to Japan and the payroll requirements, there are quite a bit of documents that are required both from the company and from the employee, but not also the employee, but also from, if they have a spouse, also documentation from the spouse, and then also the copy of the employee bank book is very important. Though, again, Japan is moving toward more of an electronic system, a lot of documents are still stamped with what's called a company chop. And so to keep that in mind when setting up payroll, that item has been completed because it is a requirement in Japan.
Great, thank you, panelists. Now we'll go ahead and answer some of the questions that have come in. The first one was global workforce planning, system of record, currency conversion, and consolidated reporting. Is there a perfect system?
So I'll take that one, Maggie. Thank you. So I think the most obviously sophisticated and global systems that are really being developed from an enterprise standpoint really is around Oracle, SuccessFactors, Workday, and to some extent ADP in terms of the type of workforce planning you can do in them and how you can do the projections and everything. It is very hard from a they certainly do handle the currency conversions and they do sort of the FP&A activities, but in terms of a perfect system, they really don't allow you enough in terms of covering what you need from an HR as well as a payroll perspective. And obviously, to a certain extent, there are companies like ADP and Northgate that do have more of the global payroll systems. But I would say from the payroll and the HR perspective, it still is very much a work in progress.
And in regards to the payroll systems, we're still in a stage of siloed systems versus unified systems. And so when you're looking at systems, how you look at your requirements is really important versus the capabilities of the systems. For example, in the US, there's a lot of unified systems. However, from an international point of view, technology is about 8 to 10 years behind.
Great, thank you. Our next question is, what specific documentation is required when onboarding an employee in Japan? How are involuntary terminations handled?
Thank you, Maggie. I'll take that question. The specific documentation that's required when onboarding an employee, for example, in our overview, we went through the pension book and the employee bank book, spousal pension book. Each country has a unique list of requirements, and to build that out, it also depends on the type of entity. So you must have a good understanding of how your company is set up, on what is the proper steps on onboarding employees to your company. In regards to Japan and involuntary termination, terminations in general in Japan are complex. There are different requirements and laws. For example, the Labor Standards Act lays out a process in which a company must follow in regards to involuntary terminations.
Great. Thank you. Next question is, outside of what was covered during the general payroll discussion, is there anything else that we need to know about Taiwan and the Philippines? Maggie,
I'll take that question. So in regards to what we have covered and what is outside, for Taiwan, for example, you are required as an employer to contribute to an employee fund. Both employers and employees must have wages withheld, and the proceeds do go to a general fund similar to our Social Security system here in the U.S.
Okay. Next question, what payroll rules apply specifically to Australia?
Generally, Australia is very similar to the other countries in terms of the payroll tax and the statutory benefit requirements. They do have a unique system. There is a superannuation fund for the pension savings plan, which is very important to the employees down there. They actually can participate individually as well as a company. So when you're starting out, if you're only talking about a small number of employees, they may want to exercise that option to participate individually. But it is a great pension system, and that's the only thing that I would say is different. But go ahead, Nick.
Yeah, I think the other item that I would definitely mention is work cover. So in a lot of countries, here in the U.S., we have workers' compensation insurance. However, in a lot of countries, you have work cover programs that cover the workers' compensation through the social program. However, Australia is one exception where it is separated from the social program. So that is definitely one item to keep your eye out.
But Nathan, isn't it also true that in a country like Singapore, the workers' comp is tied to an individual versus to a company? So you can't have just a workers' comp coverage. You need to, every time you hire or somebody leaves, you have to up or down your coverage associated with that employee.
Very good, Raghu. Yes, definitely in Singapore, employee A is covered specifically and underwritten for the plan. If employee A were to leave, you just can't move employee B into the plan of employee A.
Okay, great. What reputable sites can I refer to when seeking specific employment-related legislation in China?
And I think from that perspective, obviously, here in the U.S., we do rely a lot on the international law firms such as Baker & McKenzie and DLA Piper. There are some very large law firms in China that do also do a great job in terms of getting specific employment information, like Ying K law firm is one of the biggest out there. So I think those would be the recommendations we would have.
Great. Next question. Are offshore pension plans taxable in China? Who are the major payroll agencies doing business in China?
In regards to local payroll companies in any in any country, it is important to look at how the system is structured, how the operations are structured, and what is best going to match your organization. That is going to be the best for you in your business.
Great. The pension plan.
For example, with the offshore pension plan taxable in China, yes, they are and very complex to implement. I would definitely recommend seeking counsel when implementing these type of plans in China.
Okay, great. What is the best authorized wage deduction practice for withholding money from employees' paychecks when needed?
I think this, just from a general perspective, we've obviously been doing payroll for 19 years internationally, and we have our network of in-country providers that have locally authorized systems, the payroll systems that are kept up to date to make sure that they are in conformance with the payroll tax and statutory benefit deductions. And I think it's important to make sure that you go with a reputable firm that is using a system that is connected to, the payroll tax and statutory benefit authorities and doing the filings and making sure that they are responding to the government questions and queries. But it is important to have in-country providers with systems that are compliant from a tax and a statutory benefit perspective.
Okay. Next question that we got in. We're still really small in Singapore and Japan. What's the best way of getting benefits that aren't super expensive? Also, in Japan, since they're, one moment.
So I think from that perspective, we obviously do a lot of benefits administration in a lot of these countries, and we have local brokers that provide anything from the medical insurance, life insurance, enhanced pensions and savings plans. Some of them are available individually. Some of them you have to have 5 or more employees. So I think from that perspective, it's very important to, at least we can use our network and find out for you what is available and what can happen.
And just one word of caution, for example, in Japan, when looking at a supplemental plan, you must look at how it's going to interact with the mandated program as well, and make sure that both plans are in compliance because there are specific pension rules and regulations.
Okay, great. So we have time for 2 more quick questions. Our local team has already made an offer to a candidate and we are not fully aware of local employment laws. How do I minimize employment law exposure/risk in this situation?
I think from that perspective, obviously we highly recommend employment agreements or contracts that are in compliance with the local labor laws and statutory requirements. I think from the perspective of making an offer, the candidate would have an expectation that you would enter into a formal employment agreement with them, and it would address specific issues, especially around holidays, vacations, statutory leaves, benefits, as well as, most importantly, the termination severance provisions that need to be addressed when you are entering into it. It's important to remember that the employment agreement really governs everything as it relates to that person's employment and is going to be the governing document over everything they do when they work for the company.
The only word of caution is because if somebody has made an offer, assuming it's a verbal offer, be very careful not to present and then, so be very mindful of that. Consult with a lawyer or the right service provider to get that template and use that, please.
Okay, great. One last question. What benefits are required to be provided by a company operating in Japan?
So, of course, you have the statutory requirements in Japan, similar to many nations internationally, but you have pension, Social Security, workers' compensation, and in those three areas, they also include the medical expenses and also medical coverage from the government. Supplemental plans are not mandated, but may be customary.
Okay, great. Well, thank you everyone for attending. We have a few more questions in the queue, so we'll respond to those individually via email. You can also reach out to the panelists individually. Their emails are shown on your screen. And then if you have any other questions, please feel free to email us at marketing@globalupside.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.